The shoreline was silent except for the crackle of flames. It was the aftermath of a night no one would forget. The great hall of a rival chieftain lay in ruins, its carved wooden beams collapsed into glowing embers. Smoke drifted into the cold northern sky, carrying with it the scent of ash and defeat. Around the wreckage stood warriors with axes still wet from battle, their faces hardened not by chaos, but by discipline. At the center of it all stood the man who had ordered it. He did not shout. He did not celebrate. He watched. Hours earlier, he had invited his rival under the promise of negotiation. Words were exchanged. Oaths were sworn. And then, at the perfect moment, steel answered where diplomacy ended. The strike was swift. The resistance crushed before dawn. By sunrise, the message was clear: defiance would not be tolerated. The survivors understood. This was not blind fury. It was calculation. A public display of power meant to echo across fjords and forests. Within days, stories of the burning hall would travel farther than any ship could sail. And with each retelling, his name would grow darker. This was how his rise began, not with a crown, but with fear. For generations, the word Viking has been used to describe chaos, wild warriors driven by rage, descending from the sea to burn and plunder without thought. But the rise of this king tells a different story. His brutality was not madness. It was method. He understood something many of his rivals did not: power in Scandinavia was not inherited peacefully. It was carved out of conflict, defended by reputation, and secured through decisive action. He emerged in a world where leadership was fragile. Chieftains ruled scattered territories, and loyalty was earned through strength, wealth, and success in war. A weak leader did not last long. Rivals watched constantly. Alliances shifted like winter winds. In such a landscape, hesitation meant death. To survive was one challenge. To dominate required something far colder. His name would eventually command obedience across fjords and farmlands, but in the beginning, he was simply one contender among many. What set him apart was not only his skill in battle, but his willingness to do what others would not. He struck first. He punished publicly. He made examples of those who doubted him. Where other leaders relied on honor alone, he relied on results. Raids brought wealth, and wealth brought followers. But fear brought silence, and silence brought control. Word spread that he did not forgive betrayal. That he did not tolerate weakness. That challenging him meant more than defeat, it meant humiliation or destruction. In a culture built on pride, that threat was powerful. Yet his rise was not driven by cruelty for its own sake. It was driven by ambition. He saw beyond local feuds and small rivalries. He imagined something larger, greater territory, unified power, a crown that would not be easily taken. To reach that goal, he would need ships, warriors, alliances, and above all, a reputation so fierce that many battles would be won before they even began. But ambition creates enemies as quickly as it creates followers. Every act of strength deepened old grudges. Every victory planted seeds of revenge. And as his influence expanded, so did the number of men who waited for him to fall. Before he could rule, he would have to survive a world that rewarded brutality, and punished failure without mercy. Scandinavia in the 9th century was not a unified kingdom but a fractured world of competing chieftains, shifting alliances, and constant tension. Deep fjords cut through rugged mountains, isolating communities from one another. Small settlements clung to narrow strips of farmland between forest and sea. Winters were long and harsh, and survival depended on preparation, strength, and cooperation within tightly bound families. Yet beyond each valley lay another leader with his own ambitions, and peace rarely lasted long. Power rested in the hands of jarls and petty kings, men who controlled land and commanded warriors through loyalty and reputation. Leadership was not secured by ceremony alone. It had to be defended repeatedly. A weak chieftain could be replaced. A defeated one could be forgotten. The local assembly, known as the Thing, offered a place for disputes and law, but even there, influence often followed the edge of a sword. In this world, authority depended on visible strength. Honor shaped everything. A man's name carried weight, and insults could spark blood feuds that lasted generations. Wealth was measured not only in land but in silver, weapons, and loyal fighters. Successful raids across the sea brought treasure and status. Those who returned with gold and stories of victory attracted followers eager for a share of future spoils. Those who failed lost respect quickly. Competition for land intensified as populations grew. In regions like western Norway, arable soil was limited, and inheritance disputes were common. Younger sons without clear claims often sought opportunity beyond their homeland. Ships became lifelines to expansion, linking scattered settlements and enabling swift strikes against rivals or foreign shores. In such an environment, brutality was not simply cruelty. It was a signal. A decisive act against a rival could prevent years of rebellion. A public punishment could discourage dissent before it began. Leaders learned that fear, when used carefully, could stabilize power just as effectively as generosity. It was within this volatile landscape that he began to shape his ambitions. He understood the unwritten rules of his world: hesitation invited challenge, weakness invited rebellion, and mercy, if shown too often, could be mistaken for vulnerability. To rise above the countless rival chieftains, he would have to master both the politics of the hall and the violence of the battlefield. He was not born into uncontested power. His early years were shaped by tension, rivalry, and uncertainty. Whether the son of a local chieftain or a lesser noble family struggling to maintain influence, he grew up in a world where strength decided inheritance more than birth order. From a young age, he witnessed disputes settled with steel rather than words. Feasts that began with laughter could end in blood. Oaths were sworn over drinking horns, but broken just as easily when ambition demanded it. One defining moment came when his family's position was threatened by a rival faction seeking control of their territory. The challenge was not only political but personal. Land, honor, and legacy were all at stake. As alliances shifted, he saw how quickly loyalty could disappear when fear or opportunity intervened. Some who had once pledged support now stood silent, waiting to see who would prevail. Instead of retreating, he chose to act. He gathered a small group of trusted warriors, men bound not just by promise of reward, but by shared risk. Together, they made a calculated move against a rival settlement that had openly questioned his family's authority. The attack was swift and deliberate. It was not a reckless assault driven by anger. It was time to strike when defenses were weakest and resistance divided. The victory was decisive. A rival leader was eliminated, and those who survived were forced to swear loyalty or flee. Word of the strike spread quickly through nearby fjords. Some condemned it as ruthless. Others admired the boldness. What mattered most was the message: he would not wait to be cornered. That early triumph changed him. It showed that controlled aggression could shift the balance of power. It attracted new followers, men impressed by his resolve and eager to share in future success. But it also created lasting enemies. Families connected to the fallen rival did not forget. Blood feuds rarely ended with a single death. From that point forward, his path was set. He had tasted authority gained through force. He understood that hesitation invited weakness. And as his confidence grew, so did his willingness to make harsher choices when necessary. The struggle for dominance had begun, and he intended to finish it. With his first decisive victory behind him, he began to think beyond local rivalries. Small conflicts had proven his strength, but they would not secure lasting dominance. To build real power, he needed wealth, ships, and warriors loyal not just to his family name, but to him personally. Raiding offered the fastest path to all three. He invested heavily in longships, commissioning skilled shipbuilders to construct vessels that could move swiftly along the coast and deep into river systems. These ships allowed him to strike far from home and return before rivals could organize retaliation. His early campaigns targeted wealthy but lightly defended settlements across the sea. Timing was everything. He chose seasons when coastal defenses were weakest and launched attacks before dawn, using speed and surprise to overwhelm resistance. Each successful raid brought silver, weapons, and captives. More importantly, it brought reputation. Warriors from neighboring territories began seeking his banner, drawn by stories of victory and rich spoils. He rewarded loyalty generously, distributing treasure publicly so that every man could see the benefits of following him. Feasts grew larger. His hall grew louder. His name traveled farther. But he did not rely on generosity alone. When a minor chieftain refused to recognize his growing influence, he responded swiftly. Instead of open negotiation, he orchestrated a sudden assault on the rival's stronghold. The attack was precise, aimed at breaking morale rather than prolonging battle. The rival's hall was burned, and key supporters were captured. Some were executed publicly, not in chaotic fury but as a calculated warning. Fear began to do as much work as his warriors. Smaller leaders, hearing of these punishments, chose submission over resistance. Alliances formed not only out of admiration but out of caution. He understood that domination required both attraction and intimidation. As his territory expanded, so did the scale of his ambitions. Raids grew into coordinated campaigns. Temporary alliances were formed and broken when convenient. He mastered the art of dividing opponents, striking one while negotiating with another. His influence now stretched beyond his original homeland. Yet one formidable rival remained, strong, experienced, and unwilling to yield. The inevitable clash between them would decide whether his rise would continue, or end in blood. The confrontation he had long anticipated finally came when his most powerful rival refused both alliance and submission. This rival controlled a strategically vital region, rich farmland, access to key fjords, and loyal warriors who had fought beside him for years. A direct assault would be costly. A prolonged conflict could fracture fragile loyalties. So instead of charging blindly into battle, he chose a different path. He proposed negotiations. A meeting was arranged under the pretense of settling borders and restoring peace. Both sides arrived with armed escorts, but the atmosphere was outwardly calm. Feasts were shared. Oaths were spoken. Yet behind the courtesy lay preparation. He had positioned trusted men close to the rival's inner circle, ensuring that when the moment came, hesitation would not exist. The signal was subtle. A raised cup. A pause in speech. Steel flashed before confusion could turn into defense. The rival leader fell first, struck down in the heart of what was meant to be neutral ground. Chaos erupted in the hall, but it did not last long. His warriors had been instructed clearly: eliminate resistance quickly, secure the exits, leave no opportunity for counterattack. The brutality of the act was undeniable. Some called it treachery. Others called it brilliance. What mattered was the result. Without their leader, the rival faction fractured. Some attempted to avenge him and were crushed in swift follow-up strikes. Others surrendered, recognizing that resistance would only lead to further destruction. This single calculated betrayal achieved what months of open warfare might not have accomplished. Territory shifted overnight. Key supporters pledged loyalty to the stronger force. Those who had doubted him now reconsidered carefully. But victory carried a cost. Trust became scarce. Even among his allies, unease lingered. If he could eliminate a rival under the guise of peace, what guarantees protected them? Fear secured obedience, but it also planted suspicion. Still, the path to kingship now lay open. With his most dangerous opponent removed, no equal remained to challenge him directly. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. His name would now be spoken with a mixture of respect and caution. Power had been seized decisively. The throne was within reach. With his greatest rival eliminated and surrounding territory subdued, the path to kingship became less contested but no less fragile. Power seized through force had to be stabilized through control. He called for an assembly at the regional thing, where leading jarls and influential families gathered. There, before witnesses and law speakers, his claim was recognized, not only because of tradition, but because no one strong enough remained to deny it. The title of king was now his. But titles alone did not secure obedience. He understood that ruling required more than battlefield victories. He strengthened alliances through strategic marriages and oath-bond agreements, binding powerful families to his court. Tribute systems were reorganized, ensuring steady wealth flowed into his treasury. Warriors who had proven loyal were rewarded with land, while those suspected of disloyalty were closely watched. He built fortified centers in key regions, creating strongholds that projected authority and deterred rebellion. His reputation, already fierce, became a governing tool. Public punishments were rare but deliberate. When rebellion surfaced in a distant district, he responded swiftly and visibly, making clear that defiance would not be tolerated. Yet he also learned the value of calculated mercy. In certain cases, former enemies were allowed to retain limited authority under his oversight, transforming potential threats into dependent allies. Trade expanded under his rule. Control of coastal routes and river systems increased wealth and influence beyond Scandinavia. Foreign envoys approached cautiously, aware of his military capability. He maintained fleets ready for rapid deployment, ensuring that his dominance remained backed by force. But ruling through fear carried risks. Beneath outward loyalty, resentment simmered among families who had lost power during his ascent. Younger warriors, eager for their own glory, questioned whether his era should continue indefinitely. The very methods that secured his rise, swift violence, decisive elimination, uncompromising authority, had created a network of quiet enemies. Though crowned and acknowledged, his position required constant vigilance. Kingship was not a resting place, it was a battlefield of politics and perception. And as years passed, whispers of resistance began to grow louder, threatening to test whether his grip on power was as strong as his rise had been brutal. And the years that followed, his rule reshaped the balance of power across his region. What had once been a patchwork of rival chieftains became a more centralized authority under a single crown. Trade routes stabilized. Raids became more organized campaigns. Law assemblies carried greater weight because they stood behind a king whose strength few dared to question. His brutality had forged unity, but it had also left scars. Sagas and stories would later remember him as both a conqueror and a warning. To some, he was the leader who brought order out of chaos. To others, he was the man who proved that power taken by fear must always be guarded by it. The methods that built his kingdom, swift strikes, calculated betrayals, decisive punishments, became examples for future rulers who understood that mercy alone could not secure a throne. Yet every brutal rise casts a long shadow. Rival families never truly forgot. Ambitious heirs studied his path carefully. His legacy was not just land or wealth, but a model of kingship shaped by iron and resolve. If you enjoyed this story, like and subscribe for more untold history.